Good morning, everyone. So Dr. Adam Mosley from Swansea University. Would you like to come to the stage? Thank you. He'll be speaking for 30 minutes and then there'll be 15 minutes for questions.
Super. So we're gathered here today to talk about the philosophy of cosmology, but I'm going to be speaking to begin with about the philosophy that was cosmology. Modern cosmology is a scientific subject, a branch of physics, but in pre-modern times, up to say around the 18th century, cosmological thinking was undertaken primarily by natural philosophers. So it was a species of philosophy. I'm talking about cosmological thinking rather than cosmology per se, because historians of science, and that's what I'm a historian of science, we differ in our accounts of when cosmology as a discipline came into being. On the slide here we can see the Oxford English Dictionary definition of cosmos, and as that emphasizes, of course, cosmos is a Greek word. And so some historians have argued that in philosophizing about the universe, ancient Greeks can be considered to have engaged in cosmology, and indeed have argued that the term cosmology existed in antiquity. More recently, some historians of science have argued that cosmology only became the label for this scholarly activity some centuries later. And on the slide now I've added a short passage which suggests that that happened in the 18th century. I disagree with that view too. I would place the emergence of cosmology as a subject, as a category, around about 1600, towards the end of the Renaissance. But regardless of when we think cosmology per se came into being, we historians of science agree that a more or less continuous tradition of thinking about the universe can be traced from antiquity to the Renaissance and perhaps beyond. One common way of presenting the history of this tradition would be to focus on the accounts of the structure of the universe that it generated and on the role that the interplay between mathematics and philosophy generated in modifying those accounts over time. And if I were to do that today, I would speak about the cosmology of Aristotle and the difficulties that his principles of celestial motion generated for astronomers, the mathematicians, attempting to produce geometrical models of the heavens that successfully predicted and retrodicted the motions of the planets. I would then go on to explain how Claudius Ptolemy's enormously successful mathematical models as relayed to succeeding generations through his work, the planetary syntaxis, which became known as the Almagest in the Islamic world, how those models artfully broke the Aristotelian principle that celestial bodies moved with uniform circular motion using various combinations of circles to model the planetary motions. And I would then go on to explain how the discrepancy between Aristotelian cosmology and Ptolemaic astronomy stimulated a great deal of intellectual effort in the Islamic world and in the Latin West to bring about a reconciliation and to show that this culminated in the heliocentric astronomy of Nicolaus Copernicus. Copernicus's attempts to rescue Aristotelian cosmology from its technical limitations was instrumental in its overthrow, as in a process catalyzed by new empirical evidence generated with the aid of better astronomical instruments, and in the 17th century, the optical marvel that was the telescope, Because of all that, Copernicans and non-Copernicans alike found themselves abandoning the old certainties of Aristotelian natural philosophy and adopting different theories, not necessarily new theories, different theories of matter and motion. That's what I'd tell you if I was going to do that today, but I'm not. It's a well-known story. It's told in very accessible literature, but as an account of pre-modern cosmology, it's quite narrow. It focuses our attention on what scholars thought about the disposition and motion of the planets and on Renaissance debates about that topic. And those debates are very far removed from the cosmological concerns of the 21st century. So it inevitably distances ourselves from our predecessors, and it invites a certain amount of condescension about the limited understanding of the universe of pre-modern scholars. So I suggest we don't focus on the world systems that pre-moderns devised, but on the cosmological issues that exercised them. Not on the theories they developed, but on the questions they asked. And for this purpose, I'm going to draw upon the work of the medievalist, Edward Grant, who in the late 20th century published a monumental work, Planets, Stars, and Orbs, The Medieval Cosmos, 1200 to 1687. You might already detect a certain stretching of the notion of medieval in that title. At the core of Grant's study was a corpus of university texts that foregrounded the issues being addressed by their authors. Some of these texts were commentaries on earlier works, citing and discussing the work of an earlier authority, often Aristotle, or an earlier reader of Aristotle. And those works parceled up a given text, such as Aristotle's work on the heavens, into a sequence of miniature inquiries. In the 14th century, that genre, as discussed by Grant, largely gave way to the genre of quaestiones, texts structured by questions, which, philosophers being philosophers, they went on to answer. Philosophers rarely ask questions, in public at least, if they can't provide an answer to them, or the beginnings of an answer at least. From 67 works produced in the 13th to the 17th centuries, commentaries and question texts and other works prepared by 52 scholars, Grant extracted 400 questions that he felt characterized medieval cosmology. And because these questions were asked and answered within a cultural setting that had inherited and processed a vast quantity of earlier philosophical work, these questions can be used by us as a way of exploring the concerns of the broader pre-modern cosmological tradition, although with a pronounced scholastic, which is to say medieval Aristotelian bias. So let's get to it. I've got 400 questions. Let's start with question 1. Okay, I'm not going to do that. I do want to look at some particular questions, but I'm not going to take you through all of them. And in fact, we can get quite some way just by examining the categories that Grant used to organize these questions. He considered that they could be clustered under 4 broad headings, subdivided into 19 narrow groups. And the first of these categories was the world, or the universe as a whole, containing some questions on topics of particular interest to us today, I think. The second category dealt with the celestial region of the universe, containing questions pertaining to the stars and the planets and their motions, and I also want to think a little bit about those in the time remaining to me. And then there's a third and a fourth category that I won't be exploring today. The third category containing questions relating to both celestial and terrestrial regions of the universe, and the fourth category dealing with the terrestrial region alone. So let's look at some questions from the first category. On this slide is a highly curated, i.e. selective, set of the 77 questions that belong to Grant's first category. What do these questions tell us? Well, these questions tell us that medieval philosophers and their predecessors were often concerned with some fundamental issues. Has the universe always existed? Or did it come into being at some particular point in time? Will it always exist? Or will it at some point come to an end? Is it finite in scope, or is it infinite? Is there anything outside of the universe? Could there be more than one universe? Now, the answers that pre-modern philosophers gave to these questions were, and we shouldn't be surprised by this, culturally shaped. Aristotle and other ancient philosophers were often driven by a search for naturalistic explanations of phenomena, explanations that either avoided supernatural causes entirely or that characterized the divine in ways very different from the personifications of deities, the personified deities present in Greek myth. Ancient philosophers, although did not want people to think that, for example, lightning was the consequence of Jupiter throwing thunderbolts, right? They wanted to give natural explanations. But Jewish and Islamic and Christian thinkers sought to understand a universe that their God had created. And there's God in this picture, looking rather like an enthroned bishop. Thinkers from these traditions look to scripture and to theology as constraining guides for their natural philosophy. And that led to some differences in the answers they gave to some of these questions. For Aristotle, the universe was eternal, having no beginning and no end. But for late medieval Aristotelians, it was necessary to infer that because divine revelation made it clear that God had created the universe. And therefore, the universe had a beginning and it was of finite duration. The universe would end in accordance with God's divine plan. Aristotle and the medieval Aristotelians did agree that the universe was spatially bounded, rejecting the possibility of an infinite cosmos, but they disagreed about the plurality of worlds, about the possibility of multiple universes. In antiquity, there were philosophical schools whose members had argued in favor of the existence of multiple universes. For atomists, each universe was the chance creation of matter moving in the void, and it necessarily followed that there must be many universes exhibiting many different characteristics. Another school of philosophers, the Stoics, suggested that multiple universes existed sequentially in time, as they in turn came into being and then passed away, providing the basis for a new universe to emerge. Both Plato and Aristotle rejected the possibility of multiple cosmoi, multiple universes. Aristotle doing so partly on the grounds that the universe simply was the definition of the totality of all matter. Christian scholastic philosophers also tended to deny that there were, in fact, multiple universes. But they had to tread quite carefully. They could not deny attributing to God the power to create as many universes as he liked, and to the power also to vary the characteristics of each of his creations. So there were some medieval philosophers who engaged in thought experiments about the characteristics, the properties of universes other than their own. If we look briefly at questions in Grant's second category, there's 150-odd questions in that category concerning the celestial region. We again find some questions that might be interesting to us. Here, it helps to think of the heavens, or heaven, as expressed in these questions, as the pre-modern equivalent of space, although I'm heavily caveating that because we tend to think of space in terms of void, and that was something that very much was not what pre-modern thinkers tended to mean when they thought about the heavens. From Antiquity through to the Renaissance and beyond, philosophers asked questions about this part of the universe. Is it empty? No. Is it filled with matter? Typically, yes. What kind of matter is found there? How is that matter distributed? Why do the celestial bodies, the stars, and the planets appear to us as they do? What shape is the universe? Does direction apply out there in the heavens? What causes the motion of bodies in space? This time I'm not going to comment on the answers to those questions, although I'm happy to address them in the discussion if you would like. The medieval philosophers tended, except when they were trying to accommodate passages from the Bible into their cosmology, they tend to be more in tune with the answers given by Aristotle in Antiquity in answering these questions. And to say much more about the answers to these questions would take us much deeper into Aristotle's natural philosophy than I think we need to go today. But what I would invite you to do instead is to think about and keep thinking about, as you listen to the presentations through the rest of the day, which of these questions are still meaningful to us in the 21st century? To what extent, when we think about the questions that pre-moderns were asking about the universe, do we see ourselves reflected in their concerns to know about the cosmos that they inhabited? By focusing on cosmological questions rather than complete cosmological systems or theories, we can better see, I think, the continuities between pre-modern attempts to understand the nature of the universe and those of the present. Having said that, my presentation of those questions has been highly selective. And I can't resist ending my presentation today with one cosmological question that's very different in kind from the others. And I'm going to present this because it's perhaps my favorite of all the cosmological questions that I've encountered from the pre-modern period. This is a question that appears in a text called The Natural Questions, prepared by the 12th century English philosopher Adelard of Bath. And it's a text that predates the Aristotelian revival in the Latin West, which fueled the scholastic movement and made Christianized Aristotelianism the predominant form of natural philosophy. And here's the question. What food do the stars eat? Now, again, I think this question, no less than the other questions I presented, provides us with an opportunity to reflect on the similarities as much as the differences between cosmological thinking then and cosmological thinking now, or at least physical thinking. It seems a strange question to us, but when we begin to unpack it, we can detect, I think, some sense to that question. And I've cheated because I only put half the question on the slide, because the full question is, if the stars are animate, what food do the stars eat? And by animate, Adelard, in common with other natural philosophers, would have meant endowed with a soul, that is, endowed with an intelligence to direct their movements. And it makes sense, perhaps, when we think about embodied souls as requiring some sustenance, particularly if we appreciate that Adelard was working more within the Stoic tradition than the Aristotelian one. And in that tradition, there was not a sharp distinction between the celestial and the terrestrial region, and the Stoics tended to think of the celestial region as formed by the vapors, the attenuated matter rising up from the center of the universe, and they tend to think of the celestial bodies as fires burning in the heavens rather than as a separate category. And again, if we think of fires, it makes sense to think that fires need some nourishment to keep burning. I'm going to end my presentation there. Thank you for your attention. I hope I've given you some food for thought.
Thank you very much, Adam. Now, do we have any questions from the floor? Yes, at the back in the mustard.
Thank you for a wonderful talk, Shemai Barada. Do you think that the time this has taken to do, we've gained or lost anything in the language that's been translated from the natural philosophers?
So do you think we have difficulty understanding what their thought is? Okay. It certainly does require some work, and there are experts who have spent their lives studying medieval scholastic philosophy, for example. I'm not one of those experts. I inhabit the 16th and 17th centuries more habitually than that. But it is a skill. I guess another way of thinking about that, might we lose that skill of understanding our predecessors? And we will lose that skill if people don't continue to develop it. But we can, because it's such a coherent tradition, I think we can learn to understand the language that these philosophers were using and translate that language into modern day terms if we need to.
Yes, at the back there in the pink shirt, I think it is. It's you. Yes.
Cheers. Thank you for a wonderful whistle-stop tour. I'm just wondering, in your opinion, the question you've just put up there now, I mean, do you think that reflects on different attitudes to what life means and consciousness means? Thanks.
Yes. So, of course, this kind of question is being produced in a cultural environment in which people are considering the nature of angels. And angels being an example of an intelligence that is not embodied in a corporeal form. So there is a tendency in, and I'm generalizing wildly here, in medieval philosophy to think differently about the relationship between mind and matter than perhaps we think of, although, of course, it's not clear that we've solved the question of the relationship between mind and matter.
Yes, at the back as well, in the black. That's you. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Very enjoyable talk. It's very European focused.
Mm-hmm.
I'd appreciate if you could maybe comment on what was going on in Chinese civilization, Indian civilization, other civilizations around the world at this time, where they were clearly thinking along these lines, etc., etc. So if you wouldn't mind commenting on that.
Clearly, multiple cultures have their own cosmology or cosmogony, so they think about the creation of the universe. I am not competent to speak in any meaningful way about cultures outside of Europe, I'm afraid.
Yes, in the front row there, so in the blue shirt, yes.
So I have a question about the following. So the way you phrase those questions have resonance with modern cosmologies. But of course, when you talk about the universe, for example, everybody in this room knows what we're talking about. But only in the 19th century did scientists realize that there are galaxies outside our own galaxy. Kant and where I come from, which is Durham, Thomas Wright of Durham, were the first to discover galaxies and talk about island universes. So what does Aristotle and all these other people mean by the universe? All they knew was the sun, the solar system, and a few stars. So they had no idea that there are other galaxies. So what exactly, and how should we interpret and connect that to our current questions about the universe?
Sure. So they thought of a bounded universe. So they thought that the Earth was the center. Then you have a sequence of celestial bodies. Then you have a sphere of fixed stars. And then you have possibly, and the number varied, you may have other spheres outside of the sphere of fixed stars that were added to the system in order to accommodate the full set of motions, because Aristotelians believed that you needed one sphere per motion, and they were trying to accommodate all the motions that they could see of the fixed stars over time as well as the planets. So, yeah, it's a much smaller cosmos, a much smaller universe than ours, but based upon what they could see, right? Now, of course, we have other tools, some tools that extend our quote-unquote vision, and some tools that allow us to detect things from further away, right? So we have different tools that give us insight into the much bigger universe of which we're speaking. But they thought they were thinking about the whole thing, because as far as they were concerned, that was the whole thing, right? Based upon the evidence that they had available to them. So for me, I think what's interesting is to reflect on the fact that they were asking the biggest questions that were possible for them. And some of those questions, I think lead in directions like possible other universes that we would not immediately have imagined when thinking about what pre-modern people chose to exercise themselves with when they were thinking about the nature of the created world.
So this would be, for example, question 6, would be, are there other solar systems? We know the answer to that already, sure. It's not the way we think about the multiverse today.
No, that's right. But I don't think, I think the thing we not want to avoid doing is saying, well, why didn't these ancient people think about things the way we did? All right. We want to think, what questions were possible for them, and actually the range of questions that were possible for them, I think, take us quite some way into thinking quite deeply about the nature of the universe.
Yes, the gentleman in the mask on the left-hand side over here.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering, when does cosmology become astronomy, and what's the difference between the two terms?
So already in Antiquity, there was a difference between cosmology and astronomy. And we can see this, for example, in Aristotle's writing on the heavens, where Aristotle explains that the task of the philosopher is to understand causes, to ask the why questions, to ask, what's the nature of matter in the heavens, what are the nature of the motions, and so on. And then the phrase that is brought out already in Antiquity is that the role of astronomers is to save the phenomena. In other words, the role of astronomers is simply to produce mathematical models that allow you to do useful things, predicting, retrodicting the motions of the celestial bodies, and they may need to do some tricky mathematics to do that, and the mathematics that they do, the models that they do, are not meant to be understood as modeling reality. This is a characterization of astronomy that astronomers tend not to agree with through Antiquity to the Renaissance. So you get mathematician after mathematician really arguing for a stronger mathematical basis for cosmology, and that plays out in the debates involving Copernicus and his successors, people like Johannes Kepler and Galileo Galilei and René Descartes up to Isaac Newton. What role is there for mathematics in finding out the structure of the universe? And someone like Kepler is very adamant that your mathematics and your physics of the heavens should not diverge, right? Which is what leads him to elliptical rather than circular motions for the planets.
Yes.
Sorry.
You go, keep going.
But I was going to say, but astronomy and cosmology coexist from Antiquity, so they're both around.
And the gentleman in the middle there, in the centre of the row, yeah.
Yes, thank you for that. Just one thought I had was that in ancient times, my impression was that astrology was very powerful. Was there a tie-up between astrology and astronomy, and how did they interact? And did one grow out of another?
So this is the third category of the cosmological questions. What's the relationship between the celestial and the terrestrial? How do the celestial bodies influence the terrestrial regions? So yes, astrology is an important motivator from Antiquity onwards for the work of astronomy, for determining the place of the planetary positions, and natural philosophers are offering explanations of how it is possible for the celestial bodies to have some influence on things happening on Earth. And there are a range of explanations that are offered, typically involving the light or some other invisible influence, some influencing ray, or some effect, consequence of the motions interacting with the lower regions. I don't know how much you want me to say, because I could say a lot more about astrology, but it's extremely important. It's extremely important all the way through to the Renaissance. People like the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler are also working within astrological frameworks, and astrology is one of their motivations for doing astronomy. That much is clear.
Just one more question. Sorry, the one at the back was the first hand up, right at the back and the back.
Back to the animation of celestial objects. I believe in St. Paul's letters to the Corinthians, in one of them, he talks about the glory of the sun, the moon, and the stars, and that could be interpreted as them having their own personality. Did that have any influence, that particular passage, have any influence on early Christian cosmology?
I would have to check for that specific passage. I don't remember off the top of my head. What is clear is that even in pre-Christian cosmology, and so this was something that could easily carry through to Christian cosmology, one of the arguments offered as a strong motivation for studying the celestial regions was their greater perfection than anything in the terrestrial realm. So that by studying the heavens, the argument went, one was studying divinity, right? One was getting closer to the divine. In the Christianized versions of that's often, that's often carried through. There are some passages from St. Paul that are used to provide motivation for studying the heavenly bodies, for emphasizing astronomy as an important tool that actually plays a role in things like the Reformation in the 16th century. But the question about intelligences and their role in the heavens tended to go down more the technical route of asking, well, if there are intelligences that are responsible for the celestial motions, are those intelligences inhabiting the visible bits, the planets, or are they inhabiting the sphere, the orb into which the planet is thought to be embedded, which is not visible, but is the mechanism by which, in this tradition, the motions of the planets is explained. So that each orb needs to be turning. We only see the planet because the planet has a particular point in that orb, but it is within a sphere or orb that Aristotelians are explaining the motions, because it's important to them that it's circular motion, and it has to be a circular object, a spherical object that is doing that, moving.
Thank you very much. It's certainly a good range of questions there, covering a wide field of what you've talked about today.